All right. Hey, Cleantechers, we are back with the 10th quarterly Cleantech Journalists Roundtable. It's hard to believe that we've been doing this for over 2 years, but they continue to be one of the highlights of our content stream in the quarter. And we've got journalists from 4 news sites that are covering, either their sites cover the sector or these reporters cover our sectors as part of their beat. And we're just delighted to have them here. So I'm going to just do quick introductions here. Jen, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Delowy. I cover energy and environmental policy at Bloomberg News, where I've been since 2015, based in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to be here today.
All right. John Engel.
Yeah, I'm John Engel. I am the Senior Content Director for Renewable Energy World. We're a B2B trade media digital publication covering primarily solar, wind, and storage, and also host a solar podcast called Factor This.
Nicola?
Hi, I'm Nicola Groom. I cover energy and environment policy at Reuters. I'm based in California, and I have been covering clean energy since 2008.
And Zach?
I'm Zach Shahan, CEO and Chief Editor of Clean Technica, where I've been covering clean tech for 15 years, since 2008, and running Clean Technica since 2010. We focus on solar, wind, energy storage, and mostly these days electric vehicles. We also have the Clean Tech Talk podcast. Good idea to mention that, John.
All right. We have gotten a unusually large amount of audience questions pre-submitted, so we could probably take the whole hour just on those. I do want to do a round robin to get all of your views. What are the 3 biggest stories emerging in 2023 that you see, and what makes them big? Let me start with you, Nicola.
I mean, the biggest is implementation of Inflation Reduction Act. That's really taking up the majority of my time these days. And so, you could kind of splinter off various different stories from that. But for me, I would say one of the things we're tracking most closely is the momentum towards creating a domestic supply chain for clean energy technologies. As someone who's covered this sector for 15 years, this seems like really huge. There's been all sorts of tension between domestic manufacturing arms of these industries versus the developers during the entire time I've covered this industry, and to see some of these huge multi-billion-dollar announcements now coming out of factories, and we're really just at the beginning stages of that, is a big deal. And how those all get developed and which technologies get really take off domestically, and where they're going to get the labor from, and the materials. All of that is just a lot of stuff to dig into.
Good. All right. Jen, 3 big stories.
Well, I'll pick the biggest. The biggest one that's kind of top of mind for me now is offshore wind. And I think partly it's because I'm writing about it a lot, but partly because it encapsulates so much of what's happening across kind of the clean energy space in the U.S. right now. It's an industry that benefits from big political goals. Biden has set this, promise and goal of 30 gigawatts of capacity being installed by the end of the decade. But it also has major policy tailwinds from states that have, enacted offshore wind purchase commitments and of course, all the expanded incentives under IRA. So all these things are going right, and yet it's also battling supply chain challenges, constraints on domestic manufacturing of key components, opposition from neighboring communities, and other ocean users, I guess I should say, as well as all the questions about its social license to operate, with concerns about whale deaths and impacts on fishing. And I guess I should, without belaboring it too much, I would just say they're also, battling inflation-stoked costs that are so high that some of these developers are looking to renegotiate their PPAs or take write-downs. And all these projects are competing for limited grid connection opportunities. And it just seems to me that that's kind of it's a microcosm or it's a one sector example of something we're going to see repeated just across the clean energy space, and the issues are different but similar. And I just see what happens with offshore wind over the next 3 to 5 years as being kind of an indicator of how the progress post IRA goes.
All right, Mr. Engel.
I was hoping I wouldn't be last, so it's you, Zach. You know how this goes. This first question, when we list three and you're the last one, it's always fun to pick up the pieces. But echoing those first two comments, yeah, I mean, implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act is huge, and I think we're all writing about that every day. I'll take something that's maybe not the biggest, but it's timely, given that the House Ways and Means Committee was marking up the Congressional Review Act, the challenge to President Biden's 2-year pause on new solar tariffs. I think that's something that, at least in the solar industry, which I spend most of my time reporting on, is top of mind and very scary. So if you look back a year ago in April, we were dealing with a lot of projects coming to a halt. A lot of people were afraid that the modules they were bringing into the country were going to face retroactive tariffs because of the Oxen solar case. And then in June, you get this reprieve from President Biden, who says, okay, we'll give you 2 years. Inflation Reduction Act is coming. Ramp up domestic manufacturing capacity and at least, lessen the blow a little bit. So everyone sat at ease thinking that at least we had some time to get ready for this massive shift to domestic manufacturing. Well, if the CRA moves forward and Biden's pause is undone, that could have major ramifications for this industry. And in 2 weeks, we should be getting a final ruling from the Department of Commerce on the Oxen tariff case. So that's coming up on May 1st. So you have these two stories that are moving kind of in lockstep on timing and could drop around the same time and lead to a lot of uncertainty within the industry. So, I mean, when that challenge was first launched, when was it? Earlier this year, the CRA, I kind of wrote it off and thought that it was a procedural maneuver that Republicans were going to try to use to, be a thorn in Biden's side. But it looks like it does have some juice, and a lot of people are worried.
All right, Zach. You're three.
Yeah, John. Well, the good thing is, John, you guys are always covering the panel is very good at covering all the renewable energy topics and leaving me to talk EVs. So, sorry.
I told you this is where his Tesla fixation will come in. You watch.
Yeah, no. I mean, the big thing, what Nicola said, the IRA. I mean, this touches so many industries that we cover. So across the board, the IRA is the big story, and just it's stimulating an enormous amount of activity. But the particular aspect of that I would focus on is the battery space, especially EV battery space. It's stimulated tons of investment in EV battery, even mining, cell production, pack production in the United States. I've talked with a number of battery experts from the U.S. and abroad who have indicated they have directly moved manufacturing or planning manufacturing in the U.S. because of the IRA. There are huge incentives for manufacturers beyond the tax credit for consumers. They can get subsidies for mining, for cell production, for battery production, and there's 4 levels they can get for processing as well in the middle. And this has actually influenced the European market strongly because we're sort of responding late to China, which has been leading on EV batteries for a while. But no one expected the US to go ahead and jump so far ahead. And now Europe is like, hey, we need stronger incentives because all these battery production plants that were supposed to happen in Europe are moving to the US. So there's people who are very concerned about stronger EU policies that will, stop the bleed of battery production facilities moving to the US. The other big story I'll highlight is the spread of low-cost EVs around the world. So the cost of EVs have been coming down, getting more and more competitive, but it's still heavily been focused on richer markets, the US, Europe, China. And now there are a handful of Chinese and Vietnamese, but especially BYD from China is really expanding its sales of electric vehicles into a lot of markets, a lot of underserved, completely unserved markets. And so they're introducing low-cost, compelling, good range electric cars into all over the world. And I think anyone who thinks they're going to catch up with BYD is going to be facing a big challenge, because they're already about neck and neck with Tesla for sales of full battery electric vehicles across the world. If you count plug-in hybrids, they're far ahead of Tesla. But they're now just really expanding their sales beyond China. So it's a big fun story to be watching. And there are other manufacturers trying to do the same. Of course, Tesla's always expanding a bit, but not as much.
All right, so I'm going to do a second round robin, but come back to that. Zach, I think I know what your vote is, but 6 barriers to clean economy scaling: supply chain instability, shortage of workers, critical minerals, transmission, storage, permitting. Some people say the backlog in government workers to process things like interconnection queues, et cetera. So let's say it's a 7. In your view, which is the toughest to tackle and why? John?
This is the one where you wish you went last. I would say the permitting front. I mean, we talk about it a lot, but from the local to the federal level, that just getting projects off the ground and getting them to NTP is really, really hard right now. And I think that kind of dovetails into my, off the beaten path, what's the barrier that we're not talking about? And I bring it up all the time, is just bandwidth. I think we have this huge demand for clean energy, and a lot of new IPPs are entering the market and trying to own and operate assets. And the supply of projects that are available to acquire and to take to commercial operations is very, very small right now. There's not enough of them. And a lot of that is due to the permitting challenge and due to the workforce challenge. And I think that's one of the things we'll talk about in terms of, can the Inflation Reduction Act reach its full promise, is that it's a slog out there right now. And you see these large platforms like the EDPs and the AESs circling like sharks to get their hands on these projects, but the early stage developer is having a really hard time getting to that point. They're sitting on projects for a lot longer than they used to have to, and that costs money. It takes time. It strains resources. So I would say bandwidth. That's the thing that I think is toughest right now. We want to do a lot, but we just can't.
Nicola, and if there's a barrier I didn't name that you think is bigger than any of those, please let me know. But of those I listed out, what would you tag as the biggest and thorniest one to tackle? Nicola, you're on mute. Well, Jen, can I go to you?
Happy to jump in. Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think, and I told you this before we chatted today, if you ask about something like this, I'm going to be hard pressed to pick the biggest problem, because they're all so big. I will echo John a little bit, but expand on it. I think permitting, but especially with regard to transmission, is just a huge challenge. Arguably the most difficult issue without a quick fix, even if Washington kind of reaches consensus on a federal permitting overhaul. I've talked to one just in the last couple of days. I talked with a renewable power advocate who stressed to me that you really can't build massive industrial facilities across the country at the speed and the scale required if you're going to put every single one of them through community decision making processes. And there isn't a good fix for that. We want community voices to be, we want communities and local residents to be part of these decisions. And yet, that's a real challenge to getting these things built. And it's just not easy to solve. And then, of course, we're looking, developers of new renewable projects are looking at potentially 7-year waits for interconnections, in the queue. And PGM, for example, I've heard that. And that's, we're looking at the end of the decade at a time when the IRA's benefits are going to play out over the next 10 years. That eats up a big chunk right there, and I think we just can't talk enough about it. The one thing that I would add is kind of a sleeper issue, and I think it's a significant short-term barrier, is just policy uncertainty around some of the tax incentives that were expanded or created under the Inflation Reduction Act. The Treasury Department is obviously churning through these, issuing pivotal rules and guidance for claiming these tax credits, but they if you're a developer and you're waiting to go FID on a project, they can't go fast enough for you. And these are really critical decisions they're making about, how much domestic content or what constitutes domestic content sufficient to get an extra 10%, tax credit. And that can make or break a project. So, I think it's a short-term issue, but it is one that we're going to see affect decision-making over the next 6 months or 12 months, I think.
Nicola, I think we've got you unfrozen. What of the barriers that we listed out, what is your reporting telling you is probably the most immediate or the biggest or the toughest for these sectors to solve? Nicola, I'm not sure you can hear me. All right. Zach, you get to go, and we'll try to get that question through to Nicola.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what they said. I was like, I can't pick one, but I was leaning slightly towards transmission, and I think they explained it better than I would. This is really it's such a difficult bottleneck to quickly resolve or to resolve, like anytime in the next couple of years, So I think it's a big barrier. But then I think about workforce. This is a big challenge for scaling up a lot of industries. There's just not the electricians. There's not the skilled workforce needed to really scale up, tenfold. So that's got to build out quickly. Supply chain issues. I felt like I need to see like a really good detailed report that lays out the challenges for all of them and then gives a kind of math equation that I can pick one easily, because I couldn't really pick one. But I did lean slightly toward transmission for the reasons they've already discussed. I think that's just it's one of those issues you look at it and you're like, this is like someone, snap your fingers, fix this, because this is like I don't see the quick, easy solution for it. It's just difficult,
All right, let me come back. There's been, I think by my count, 4 questions that have come in that center around this idea of, I'm going to call it the inglorious stuff. So, for example, electrification of the vehicle fleet. Got a question here that says, what about the really heavy vehicles, the stuff that's used on mining sites or electric buses? But the things that, as I understand it, not being a materials engineer, at a certain size, it becomes too difficult to electrify the vehicle because the weight of the battery just makes it so heavy. You kind of get in this losing game. And the question is, are there other options to electrifying or lithium? A lot of questions around that. Zach, I know you're pretty vehicle focused. Perhaps you want to lead that off? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the largest truck in the world is insanely large, like mining truck. There's electric versions of it now because it's just you save that much operationally. So although, bigger vehicle, you need bigger batteries, but they also burn more fuel, like exponentially more. So the more you can cut the fuel costs by going electric, the better. So there's these giant mining trucks that are now being used in some places that are electric now. Buses are sort of a nice one because they have set routes and you can do these overhead fast, like these short charges at stops. ABB has different companies, but ABB I know has these good overhead chargers that a lot of buses use. There's a city there's cities in China. There's tens of thousands of electric buses in China. It's been a very strong case for them for a long time. The long distance heavy trucking is more challenging. That would require, a serious rollout of mega fast charging, stations. And there's still a bit of a debate about that versus hydrogen trucking. But I think the biggest issue when it comes to all this is that there's just limited battery supply, and the more you scale up any of these industries, the more pressure it puts on the battery supply for any of the other industries. So, coming to Tesla, the supposed long delay of the Tesla Semi is because the Model 3 and Model Y are so popular and Tesla only has so many batteries. Same with this, Cybertruck to some extent. So it's like the Semi could have been out years ago, and it's my favorite Tesla vehicle. I wish it was. The person who headed up that project left eventually because it took so long, I think, But basically, we have to scale up mining, processing. A mine takes 7 years to develop, for example, processing also, the battery pack production. So all of this stuff is vying for batteries, and with every part of the industry being competitive, more and more competitive, everybody wants batteries. So you can only produce so much. So it's helpful to have alternatives. And then also there's some development of lithium sulfur batteries. Someone who worked at Panasonic and Tesla, and is at Amprius now. Amprius is trying to get leadership in this. This would also be very helpful for like electric aircraft, which is a bigger challenge. But yeah, that's it on the big. I could talk all day about that. This is one of my favorite topics, so just cut me off.
No, really? Wow. Okay, Nicola, I just wanted to note it for the transcript. It was 23 minutes in before we got Zach's first mention of Tesla, so that's actually improvement. But Nicola, back to I think your connection went out when we were listing out the barriers. I wanted to know what you thought was the biggest one. So the ones that are commonly rattled off: permitting, storage, transmission, workforce development, supply chains, critical minerals. Some people would add a seventh, which is the backlog and basically not enough staffing or speed in government permitting and okaying things. There's nothing sacrosanct about that list, but if you think that's right, is there one that your reporting tells you is sort of like the biggest or thorniest or most immediate?
I mean, I would say supply chain challenges have been the thing that has taken up the most of my reporting time over the last couple of years. And, for so many different reasons, whether it was the pandemic or, forced labor concerns or just access to materials, inflation, all of that, geopolitical instability, which sort of, can aggravate any one of the things we're talking about. So, I kind of have to say supply chain challenges because there's just so many things causing those. It sort of feels like that is something that could be worked out, but it will take a long time.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that and throw this open to all of you. We got one questioner who wanted me to ask you all, what was your take on the U.S. solar industry that uses Chinese parts, how they will solve for this undercurrent in American politics that's sort of anti-PRC, anti-China, both in rhetoric and in governmental actions being taken? Any thoughts on that and how that gets worked out, given the importance you just mentioned of supply chains, Nicola?
Well, I think you see it now in, the Inflation Reduction Act really incentivizing domestic production of materials that for years have been primarily made by Chinese companies. And, it wasn't that long ago when, I think the industry was kind of okay with that. Now there is absolutely, and there's like a palpable urgency to creating a domestic supply chain for goods that we will need to meet our clean energy goals, whether it's batteries, solar panels, and then the components that go into solar panels like cells, all the way down to polysilicon. There is true desire and urgency being voiced on the part of the industry to to get that supply chain up and running. And I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but there does seem to be just a willingness there that I would say was not there a few years ago.
Another question we have, this one's from Connor Gordon at Rondo Energy. We've seen green hydrogen accomplish mainstream recognition, but some of these emerging technologies might be more efficient. Molten salts, basically storing heat. And there was a parallel question said, how do we who are solving the hard to decarbonize industries that really aren't sexy, they're not iconic, why aren't they getting more attention? So the whole idea of decarbonizing the footprint of big heavy industries through green hydrogen or heat storage. we got a lot of questions around that. I'm really interested in your all's thoughts about that because I will say, as someone who, is in the promotion business, a lot of the promotional attention does go to wind, solar, and EVs. But then you step back and the kind of like the background parts of the economy, there's a sense that, golly, this is where a lot of pollution reduction can happen, and it's not getting that much attention. Any thoughts on that from those of you who report on these sectors?
I've got one quickly, Mike. I mean, on the green hydrogen front, I think the reason you might hear less about it is because green hydrogen has been through multiple hype cycles already. It faces a number of challenges around infrastructure and the associated, application and how we're going to classify green versus blue versus gray. Will there be leakage issues, and are we actually solving the emissions problem that we're going for? I think green hydrogen just has a lot of unknowns at this point, and the groundwork is getting laid, and there are some real contracts coming together. But the problem is, even now, most of the announcements you see are memorandums of understanding. They're companies saying they've agreed to work together, but contracts aren't signed, and additional pipelines aren't getting built, and there's just a lot of real work that still needs to get done. And just quick self-plug, I mean, I did an interview that I'll publish on Monday with the CEO of Energy Vault, and they did sign a real green hydrogen contract with a real player in PG&E, the largest utility in California that's looking to solve for their wildfire risk and their resiliency concerns and going the green hydrogen route for that multi-day storage. So I think on the storage front and in the industrial heat processes front, green hydrogen and those alternative applications do present a ton of promise. It's just weeding through what's real and what's not at this point, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of not.
Jen and Nicola, thoughts on green hydrogen? How real is it, et cetera, and the alternatives like different forms of thermal storage? Any thoughts from your reporting?
Well, I would just take a step back to your broader question on the notion of why we're not talking as much about industrial decarbonization and the opportunities there. And I think, at least in DC, policymaking tends to gravitate toward what is easiest and what has the biggest lobbying oomph behind it. And I think here that is we're seeing the evidence of that with the technologies that are getting juiced. And that includes hydrogen in Inflation Reduction Act, because obviously there's a great deal of oil and large integrated energy company interest in that space. So that's benefited that. It's certainly benefited CCUS. But I think that might be a factor in why, the decarbonization of heavy industry that is so critical from a climate perspective maybe doesn't get quite the attention in the public sphere that it should. I will say, too, that, and this goes to something John said about the idea that we've been through multiple hype cycles on hydrogen. CCUS is in that space of, climate purists, many of them will say we absolutely need to deploy CCUS in a big way to meet our carbon budget and meet the numbers that we need to hit. And yet, obviously, we've been through multiple iterations of hope and failure in the CCS space. And I suspect, even though it is better poised now with the increased tax credit from 45Q from Washington, I suspect that's still a barrier.
Nicola, any thoughts on that?
I don't think I could say it any better than they just did. I would just add that there's a lot of money behind some of these technologies now, which has never been there before, and it will be very interesting to see how they develop. But in terms of, I really agree with everything John said about, in terms of coverage, in terms of news coverage, there needs to be some real heft behind some of these agreements before they will get covered.
Okay. And I should just hat tip to Jake Sussman of Ambient Fuels. He's one of the ones that put in that question there. Okay, so that, Nicola, what you just said, I just want to do a quick, maybe one word round robin, one word answer round robin. Is policy more important, or are market forces more important now at this stage of the clean energy transition? I'm really interested in your thoughts on this. Zach, markets or policy?
I think none of us really like this question because it's like we both we want both. I think they're
Cheater.
both critical. No, I think they're just it's like apples and oranges. You need them both. You need them both working together. The current corporate free market forces are working on their side. The policymakers have to make it stronger regulations. It always it's almost like just pick your favorite. I lean toward policy. I feel like policymakers have to push the corporations to do stuff or they don't do it. So I feel like that's where I always end up. And I think just one example of that is Europe with EVs, because they were about where we are with EVs for a while. Sort of hovering there, and then the regulations required that they sell a lot more, or they'd pay fines that would like bankrupt them. And so all of a sudden they go from customers don't want EVs to look at all the customers buying our EVs. It was like they had to be forced to do it, and then then you force them to stop using the argument that consumers don't want them or this or that is a problem. It's like, oh no, they will buy them if you have enough, and there's still year-long wait lists in Europe despite like 20% EV market share. So I think it's the case with everything. You have to push corporations to evolve faster. So I think that's where I end up.
All right, so John, next time Zach doesn't get to complain about going last, we're going to put him last because he wants to have it both ways. All right, Nicola, markets or policy?
I can't say that one is more important than the other. If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said markets, but that was pre-IRA. But I'm going to just speak up for markets just for a minute because, prior to IRA, pretty much all of a lot of the momentum we have seen in clean energy, particularly solar and wind, over the last decade has been because large U.S. corporations want renewable energy, and they're not being pushed to do it by federal policy. They are doing it because their investors are pushing them to do it, or their customers or their employees, whoever. And so, state policy has, kind of took a back seat to those forces for a long time. And now with IRA, that is just, the 800-pound gorilla that's going to be driving everything. But I definitely think corporate ESG goals are not going anywhere, and they are going to continue to be a huge part of what's driving this market.
Jen? Markets or policy?
Nicola. Yeah, like Nicola, I'd keep it short, but I'll just say, prior IRA, I was in the markets camp because, of course, we saw all the momentum that was happening in the private sector, even as, Trump and the Trump administration were dialing back rules that acted as a cudgel to kind of encourage more development in this space. IRA's obviously changed the game, as has the bipartisan infrastructure law. I think we are seeing right now, $150 billion in advanced energy projects and renewable projects announced since that was enacted in August. We are witnessing the power of industrial policy in this space in real time, and it's hard to deny that.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up. This comes from Michael Mulhall with Hala Technologies. Said it's been 8 months since the passage of the IRA. Based on what you who are reporting on us have seen so far, is the law having as large an impact in the climate tech space as initially expected or not? Jen, just top of mind response?
I think it's having the intended impact, but the caveat is, like I mentioned, that $150 billion figure that comes courtesy of a tally that the American Clean Power Association did in the last few days. That's huge, right? And it is, again, hard to deny that the size and scale of the investments that have been announced just in 8 short months. And yet we probably have to go 3 times faster to meet our net zero by 2050 target, right? So I guess it's a little bit of both, right? It is going well, and it is going about as expected. But the answer is that for a lot of people and for the climate math, we need to be going faster.
Nicola, I know you cover a lot of policy in your reporting. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I definitely think it is having its intended effect, but I do think that there's a bit of a delayed effect because a lot is still TBD. Folks are waiting on the Treasury Department to issue guidance on a lot of the different tax provisions. And so there's a lot of kind of sitting on the sidelines with big investments until more of those details are known, and those are going to kind of dribble out as this year goes on. And so, I think that kind of big boom momentum will be, maybe we're talking about maybe next year or the years after, rather than, right now.
Interesting. I got a question from Mark Lewis of Lime Rock Energy.
I would just
go ahead, Zach.
Completely agree with them. I would just say too, we're seeing, like I said earlier, enormous movement already. But one of the biggest things about it for me was that it's very long-term oriented. It's got a very long-term vision. So it's securing long-term support for all of these industries, so we're not seeing even we're seeing a small fraction of what we're going to see in the long run from it. But it's already so exciting because it's already moving mountains today. But by the end of the decade, we're going to be like, wow, look at what the IRA did, and bipartisan infrastructure law as well.
Hey, Mike, I want to jump in just because you deprived me of my one-word answer, and I want to be the contrarian here, where I will give you the one-word answer, and I think it's policy. And that's why I want to interject here, is just because given the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, which we're seeing now, and the billions of dollars that we're all talking about being invested in this country to support that manufacturing, most of that's not happening at the speed and scale that we're seeing today because of this historic climate law. And if you envelope in to the policy bucket the permitting challenge and grid operators and interconnection delays and the markets that we need to be established to support things like long duration energy storage and multi-day storage and all of these different elements, I think policy, while yes, corporations are going to continue to buy clean power, and that momentum is not stopping anytime soon. At the end of last year, the wind industry was taking a pretty big hit because of the fear of the ITC PTC cliff, which the industry is fairly familiar with, but that shows you the impact of policy. A lot of corporations, Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, whoever, want to buy that clean power, but that does not mean without those incentives that the train just keeps rolling. I mean, I think they're still critical, and we have a lot of growing pains to still deal with. So that's just why I wanted to interject, just to be a little different.
Okay, I gotcha. All right, Mark Lewis of Lime Rock Energy wanted me to ask you, do you think investors and miners are sufficiently focused on rapidly growing demand for core energy transition commodities such as copper, which is forecast to see strong demand growth over the next decade? Basically, he's very interested in base metals, such as copper, and I know that I guess the theme and the questions here is the view of the questioner is that there's sort of unsung trends or unsung needs that don't get the attention. So, any thoughts on metals like copper and innovations in that space? All right, Zach, I'm calling you, man.
Yeah, dude. I recently interviewed Will McDonough. I had to look up to get the name right, of ENG Energy Advisors. And this was one of the points he made, and I've talked with other people who've made it. Copper is an sort of underrepresented, underacknowledged mineral in this huge clean tech revolution. That's EMG Advisors. Sorry, I'm not sure if I said that right. But yeah, we have him on our Clean Tech Talk podcast in the past week. And it's, critical for EV charging stations, for motors, for wind turbines, for all different aspects of the revolution. And it's sort of like, oh, everybody knows copper's out there, it exists. We don't need to worry about it. So they focus on lithium or cobalt or whatever. But my understanding is, more attention and more investment does need to be put into copper. And there are other, supportive minerals and elements. I think it sort of gets back to the question we had about hydrogen and industrial decarbonization processes. Everybody gravitates toward easy, fun, quick, simple solutions. So whether we're thinking about our readers, we're thinking about what we understand. People who feed us stories are like, I understand this is great. When you get into more of the nitty gritty or the really difficult stuff to analyze, the stuff where you need an engineering degree or 5 to really make sure you understand, then it's a little bit less like, well, probably we need this, maybe we need this. I don't know. Is this good? Is this facing a big bottleneck or not? So I think we always come to that challenge when it gets outside of this the more common themes of, yeah, we need more solar. Oh yeah, we need more electric cars. It's like once you get into, is green hydrogen good or bad? What about blue hydrogen? And then it gets really sticky and it gets really hard to analyze. And I think that's also the case with minerals, where everybody talks about lithium or cobalt, but there's a lot less talk of all these other minerals that are critical to the clean tech revolution.
And Zach, before you go to get the kids, I do have a question which is tailor-made for you from Jeff Wolf of Veloce Energy. He said, thoughts around the new EPA vehicle pollution standards pushing us to a high percentage of EVs. Does it survive in the courts? Is 2 years enough to entrench the direction so that if a new president changed them, it wouldn't matter much? And I suppose a follow-up question is, do you see auto OEMs getting more involved in charging to make sure the vehicles can operate and reduce potential buyer anxiety? Pick any of those nuances, but Zach, I want to hear from you, but anybody else as well.
They can answer the other question. I'll think about that and get back. I've extended my time a little bit. I've got a little leeway, so I'll let them answer that first question while I think more about this one.
Okay. Anybody want to take the question about the impact of the new vehicle pollution standards pushing EV use? Does it survive in the courts? And is 2 years enough? You want to take that? All right, Jen, I see raised eyebrows. Go ahead, jump in.
I was thinking John was shaking his head.
That was a no. That was I don't want this one. I'm not covering it out of my wheelhouse.
Oh, I was like, oh wow, John knows the course.
No,
Nicola,
keep me away from the EPA. No, I don't have anything.
You're going to see, Nicola, that we hunt the weak. So when we have like a weakling run off the herd, that's who we're going to run down. So John, you are going to get asked a question, but I just said, all right, hey, Jen, I'm clearly crashing here as a moderator, so you got to come in and save me.
No, so I obviously I covered the EPA rollout last week, and I'm covering this space. I think it is the one thing we know for sure is that this will get challenged in the court, and there are a lot of there's some good scholarship out there that suggests it could be a challenging case. What the question on the 2 year
challenging to defend or challenging to bring? Which
challenging
will
to
be
defend. Challenging to
gotcha.
defend.
Okay.
And there's a lot of they obviously threaded the needle. This is not an EV mandate explicitly. This is a prescription. This is a performance standard that could encourage automakers to do more EV sales. That's certainly what they are analyzing at EPA and forecasting. But in rolling this out, Administrator Regan made the point that you could also see some other technologies play. That's arguably lip service, but at the very least they've written this in a way that they think obviously will comport with the law and the Clean Air Act. The issue is truly that 2 year time cycle. This is already this rule isn't going to be finalized until next March at the earliest. And while it deals with model years 2027 and beyond, it is something that a new administration could very easily come in and tinker with, just as we saw Trump do with the Obama era standards previously.
Yeah, you had the California lawsuit, which is, I think things have gotten so unpredictable with the courts that it's just really hard to know, and I'm sure like extreme legal scholars can argue both sides of this. I think the fundamental thing here is it's a question mark for a few years, and as long as it's a question mark, automakers have to be prepared. So they don't really know what's going to happen in terms of who's elected, who's not, what the courts say. So they have to be prepared. But the bigger issue is, I think any automaker that isn't completely lost knows that by 2030 they have to be a leader on EVs. I know customized ads are a thing, but when you watch even just normal TV, which I don't think is sending me customized ads, maybe I'm wrong. Every car commercial almost is an EV commercial. They all want to be seen as the leader in EVs because they know by 2030 they need to be selling a lot of EVs. They need to be a leader in EVs. So I think it's been clear. Even a few years ago at a conferences we had with the companies that design systems for automakers, they were like, nobody wants anything that doesn't have at least a plug or is fully electric. Nobody wants any designs for an outdated combustion engine system, because they all know that they're going to be dead if they're trying to, like, nobody's developing more on that front. They're developing EV powertrains. And so whether it happens or not, I think automakers have to take into consideration they might be pushed to go a little faster than they're ready for, so they better speed up. But they already know they have to speed up, or else they're going to be screwed in, like, I'm not sure if that's allowed to be said here, in 2030 and beyond. So I don't know. But as far as whether it survives the courts, who knows? Yeah, it's hard to know what happens there.
Nicola, I've got one for you. Utility scale renewable energy projects are expensive and need significant financial backing. Given how many financial companies in the energy space have historically backed fossil fuel projects, how can they start backing clean energy projects without looking like they're greenwashing? Even when they want to start doing the right thing and supporting green energy, how do they make the transition and have the media believe it? I wanted to throw that question to you and then John.
And is this is a question about financiers, or it's a question about developers?
Yes. Yeah, the financiers.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they should just do it. I mean, I don't know. There are so many companies financing this space now. I don't see it as a barrier. The fact that they have also financed fossil fuels. There probably many banks finance both things, and I wouldn't view that as a barrier for them. In terms of greenwashing, I don't know. I guess I have not seen banks and financiers caught up in accusations of greenwashing as much as, say, traditional energy companies have. But except with respect to, say, drilling in Alaska or things like that. I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly. I don't know if I'm answering the question correctly.
I think the questioner is saying, if you have a financial institution that has not been out there like BlackRock, like Goldman, with some fairly well publicized investments in clean green. So if you have sort of a firm that's historically invested in incumbent sectors and they start making the migration, how do they make that migration without inviting all these questions about their motives and whether it's serious? Is there, for example, a proportionality threshold that, however ill-defined, they need to clear? Or is there some sort of transparency in the investment that we need to get made? I think these are kind of like, I'm putting these sub-tabs onto that question, but that's how I took the question to be.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know that I have a good answer for it, except to say that there's a lot of development that's happening out there, and there will be, I think, plenty of room for new entrants. We've seen, plenty of other people kind of dip their toe in this water before and then become big players. And yeah.
Okay. John, any thoughts on that?
On the financier side, I don't think there's a whole lot of discrimination of where the capital is coming from right now. I think there's plenty of project and growth equity out there, capital out there right now for trusted technologies like wind and solar. So personally, I don't think that's a huge issue. I think if you're speaking more to what Nicola was mentioning on the development side of oil majors or conventional fossil fuel companies getting into renewables or saying that that's going to be a major slice of their pie, I think that's where I have more questions about motives and whether that's a delay and distract or if that's a true effort to decarbonize and help the climate. If you look at a company like Total Energies, which is investing billions of dollars around the world in offshore wind and other technologies, they're still investing a lot in oil and gas, and that is still a huge chunk of their business. Is the tiny sliver that's on offshore wind bad? I don't think so. I think if that money is getting spent We would like more of it to get spent, but I don't know. I see the greenwashing concerns all the time when we report on projects by companies like BP and Lightsource BP building a ton of utility scale solar in the US. I still think that's good. Would we want them to do more? Sure. But yeah, I think it's tricky.
Okay, Jen, perhaps a question for you. This is from Alex Torsky, who's with Electrata. Wanted to know, what do you see are the biggest obstacle fleets feel they face in their drive to electrify? Are some of these structural, meta, meaning to overcome them requires external force intervention like government policy, and which can be overcome simply through internal choices? So kind of a nuanced question, but just any thoughts in that general area about fleet electrification?
Yeah, no, I can tell you, if we're talking about automakers and their fleets, I think, I heard an earful from automakers in the last couple of weeks in the run up to the EPA proposal. And, their big message that they were lobbying, many of them, including those who are moving maybe a little bit slower in this space, their message to the White House was, look, these tailpipe emission standards, which are going to encourage us to push EVs harder and faster, are not all about what we can do. We can get these things off the assembly line, but everything else has to go right. The charging stations have to be deployed. The grid transformation has to happen. Transmission upgrades and to really make sure that we have the power. We have to change consumer mindset about charging. And obviously we have to deal with mineral supply issues that are very, very real and do it quickly. And so their message, which is a valid concern, the message from Detroit to DC was, look, this isn't all in our control. And so that speaks to that meta issue, that, these meta concerns, that they really don't have as much power about it. Now, to be sure, they can get these off the assembly line, and we have seen big announcements from some automakers, and Tesla and Rivian were in before the White House saying, look, IRA makes it so much easier to do this. We can go further faster. So a little bit of your answer depends a little bit on what kind of automaker you are and how you're embracing this, but certainly there's room for concern outside of what just happens at the assembly line.
What would you say about, just extend that answer out to what we'll call tethered fleets or vehicle fleets like UPS trucks that go out and come back to a place? Barriers in electrifying those. Is it easier to do? Is it harder?
I do wish we had our colleague are still on for this, but one of the, that's obviously, in some ways, that's the slim, that's the easy pickings, right? And we've already seen that, the bipartisan infrastructure law focused on school bus electrification because, these are fleets that have a central location where they can charge overnight. They can charge overnight, and they're managed fleets that don't put a huge amount of miles on them. The challenge, of course, is in kind of the rural space, but in many ways, that's the easy place where we can see some movement right away.
Mike, can I jump in there? I have a thought.
Please.
I jump in a lot of places. I can't help myself. Distribution utilities around this country are terrified of fleet electrification. It is like a very serious near-term challenge that they face. These are large loads, and the second that they come onto the grid, the entire balance of a node or a place on the grid changes. And it even happens at a smaller level if you talk about the individual EV customer. If you live in a cul-de-sac and two of your neighbors get an EV, that's a big change to what happens on that feeder. And so distribution utilities are really having to grapple with the new grid, and fleet electrification is still relatively young. Not much of it is deployed like, the Amazons and the Postal Service are trying to do. It's quite a small piece of the pie, but it will drastically change how our grid looks today. And utilities need to be progressive about not just how they put up with that load, but how they control it and how they use it as a resource too. So I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges facing distribution grids today in utilities is fleet electrification. It's a very near-term issue.
Nicola, I got a question for you. I think it's kind of tailor-made for you. The questioner asks if the NEM 3.0 decision in California, does that usher in a new round of the solar wars like we saw in 15 and 16 in the Sun Belt? In other words, are other states going to follow suit and try to pull back the financial arrangements that have really enabled rooftop solar on people's homes? Any thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I mean, obviously, people like to watch what happens in California because a lot of states do follow what California does. There is definitely a possibility that other states could enact, solar policies that are similar to California's. And some states already have policies like that. They're just not as big as California. California's solar market is so huge that it has a very outsized impact on all of residential solar, the whole national market. So yeah, it will have reverberations on the nationwide residential solar space, both policy-wise and business-wise. It'll be big.
Companion question. Another person asked, in essence, how did the solar industry show up in the NEM 3.0 debate in California? I think the perception that I hear a lot is that basically the industry was bested. It just lost, essentially. You're out in California, you cover policy. What is your perception of how the industry fared in this policy debate?
Well, it was a very lengthy process. It was a lot longer than it was supposed to be. And part of the reason it was much longer than it was supposed to be, is because the solar industry fought back so hard against the first proposal, which I believe was the end of 2021. I could be wrong on that. There was an initial proposal floated that would have included like a monthly fee for solar users. The industry fought back against that very hard. It happened to coincide with some new leadership coming into the Public Utilities Commission. That new leadership said, maybe we need to take another look at this. And so they went back to the drawing board, and they came up with a proposal that the solar industry still does not love. I think that's very fair to say, but got rid of some of the things that they were really opposed to, like that monthly fee. So, it's not as bad as they had feared, but did they get everything they wanted? No, far from it.
We are at the top of the hour, and I need to cut you loose. I'm going to close with a question that I've had. I am super interested in your all's answer on this, and I think several other people asked as well. What is the role of Twitter going forward in the life of a reporter now that Daddy's going crazy in real time? That's my assertion, not yours, but I know that over the last decade, Twitter has just become ensconced in what it's like to be you. And I'm just interested in your all's thoughts. Like, do people in our space continue to use Twitter as a media relations tool, or is its decline obvious enough that its role is diminishing? Really interested in your thoughts on this. All right, Jen, I'm volunteering you first.
Happy to chime in. So I use Twitter as a means to obviously to connect with people. I'll DM lots of folks I want to tell me stuff and try to get them to talk to me. That has not changed, and I will miss Twitter if it were to disappear without some obvious substitute for that is as convenient. I also very much value energy Twitter, right? And getting smart by engaging with, and just reading really great commentary that does pop up from smart folks on Twitter. Obviously, that's diminished with a few departures, but it's not all lost yet. And I hope if Twitter isn't what it was a year ago, in a year, I hope we find that, whether it's at Mastodon or something else, because that's truly valuable to just understand the space and so many smart people, what they're talking about.
Nicola?
I totally agree with all of that. personally, I've never been a huge tweeter. I don't tweet very much, but I do use Twitter as a resource. And I would say I've noticed definitely a little bit less activity, but not enough to drive me away yet. And I've started moving some stuff, at least my own activity, to LinkedIn a little bit, though it's a totally different platform and it doesn't kind of have that, energy Twitter conversation going on that I really appreciate and really helps me with reporting.
All right, John, you're last on the last question.
Yeah, my answer has probably evolved in the last couple of years, but when I was on more of the mainstream journalism side, Twitter was a much more useful resource. Now that I'm in trade media, I think it's kind of zero for me. LinkedIn is where I get a ton of content, where I meet a lot of sources, where people feel it seems a little more free to weigh in on issues that they think is protected by this kind of industry ecosystem that doesn't necessarily touch the public, which I think is really cool. Like I'll grab a lot of responses and comments from LinkedIn to use for kind of quick response stories. And it's a much more candid look at how the industry feels about things. Energy Twitter still has some juice to it, and the DER space has some wonky people who like to really use Twitter, and so that's fun to follow along with. But I think most of my activity has switched to LinkedIn.
Zach took the trouble to message me from the car with his answer. He said, quote, "I think it's a disaster and it's getting worse and worse, but it's still a top source of news for us." So I guess Zach had the last word.
I'll add, Mike, like stuff with the House Ways and Means Committee that was happening today with the solar CRA. That's what Twitter is great for, because I'm not on the Hill. I know some of your colleagues, Nicola and Jennifer, are, and it's great to be able to follow that blow by blow in a way that no other platform really can.
Well, I want to bring this to a close and thank the three of you and Zach for joining us. This has been awesome. It's the amount of responses we got early on, I think the most we've ever had. So really appreciate it. We will be processing this and getting both full tape and snippets out. Please accept our thanks. We would love to have you back in another quarter, and we're probably going to be expanding the roster still further. So please accept our thanks for coming on. Jen, Nicola, John, thank you, and thanks to Zach for joining us as he could. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike.
All right.